So welcome everybody. In this session this morning we're going to look at the state of play in relation to child privacy protection. There is an unprecedented number of new proposed regulation globally at US and federal level, federal level and state level in the US, where we have over 140 proposed bills. And in Europe, we see the Digital Services Act, the Online Safety Act and the Children's Code. So in this panel we are going to take a whistle-stop tour of the key developments, what it means in practice to navigate the complex landscape and aligning the requirements. What lessons can we learn from past enforcement actions, and hopefully we'll shed some light on this increasingly important topic. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. I hope they're here somewhere. We have Nicole Rocha. Nicole is head of US Affairs at the Five Rights Foundation. I'm sure you all know it very well. It's a non-profit that campaigns for children's digital privacy rights. Nicole and Five Rights have really led the way on the UK Children's Code and helped bring it to fruition. Nicole joined Five Rights from the California Assembly for Privacy and Consumer Protection, and she is also on the California Age Appropriate Design Code Act Working Party. Welcome. We also have Michael Murray, who we hope is joining us on screen. Michael is from the UK Data Protection Authority, the ICO. He's head of regulatory policy at the ICO, and he's lead on the Children's Code. And he also is heavily involved in children's engagement online. So wherever you are, Michael, welcome. We have Anna Morgan. There's Michael. Anna has flown from Dublin, so we are delighted to have her here. She's a partner in Bird & Bird in the International Privacy and Data Protection Group. And Anna is also former Deputy Irish Data Protection Commissioner.
Anna, staying with the kind of the EU-UK, a lot see, EU-UK driving some of the changes globally. And we know we have the Data Services Act and Digital Services Act and the Online Safety Act. Perhaps you can talk a little bit to those two, because I think, especially the Digital Services Act now and Online Safety are in play, and people need to start making changes if they haven't already.
I think it's a really interesting time to be in this space, to be looking at children's online lives and how they're interacting with services, because as you said, Claire, there's just so much happening. The landscape is continually evolving, and a lot of these kind of new developments are coming out of the EU kind of central legislative structures. So you mentioned the Digital Services Act. That's actually an act I'm sure lots of people in the room are familiar with it. It entered into force for the major players that were identified as very large online platforms and very large online search engines last August, and then the obligations for other providers that are captured by its scope will kick in on the 17th of February. So essentially the Digital Services Act is concerned with tackling illegal content, illegal goods and services, and it sets out a whole range of different types of obligations, but there's kind of tiers of obligations depending on the nature of the service that you provide. So in very broad stroke terms, if you are an online platform that is hosting user-generated content, then a majority of the obligations are going to fall to you to comply with in terms of moderating content, carrying out risk assessments, increased and enhanced transparency provisions, and very importantly, I think in the context of what we're talking about now, is Article 28, which requires that online platforms apply particular measures to kind of safeguard the privacy and the security and the safety of minors on their platform. Connected to that, there is an outright ban on targeted advertising for minors as well, and that's a really interesting development in European legal terms, because it's the first time that such a ban has actually been codified in law. There's a bit of a debate about how the guidelines that have been issued by different regulators to date, and whether they actually convert into a concrete ban, but now we have it in law. So the Digital Services Act is certainly set to transform the landscape in a major way. I mean, it's concerned, as I mentioned, with online content. So it's kind of an extra piece to the regulatory jigsaw in Europe, because it sits alongside all of the rules that we have on processing children's data. So obviously content and data are two separate but complementary areas that have to be kind of tackled together, really, I think, when companies are looking at their compliance obligations in this space. You also mentioned developments in online safety, Claire. And I suppose with the Digital Services Act, as I mentioned, it's concerned with illegal content in particular, but not necessarily harmful, but not illegal content. Whereas at a national level around Europe, we are beginning to see the emergence of member state laws which are concerned with tackling harmful online content. So you mentioned the UK, the Online Safety Act, which is now in force, and Ofcom is the regulator for it, and it deals with user-to-user services and search engines and regulated pornographic services. In Ireland, where I am based, we have a similar piece of legislation which came into effect within the last 6 months, and the regulator there is actually the regulator at the Media Commission, which means it will be the regulator for the Digital Services Act, but also this national law piece of legislation which is aimed at tackling very specifically defined types of harmful online content, including content that encourages people to towards kind of suicidal actions or behaviours, towards eating disorders, cyberbullying, so kind of a whole range of kind of nefarious content that must meet a significant harm test. And then across Europe, we are beginning to see the start of kind of similar types of legislation on a state-by-state basis. So the landscape is very much evolving, and I think it's going to continue to evolve. I think there's a huge challenge for companies in trying to navigate this, looking both at the EU level obligations, the particular requirements that might apply in specific member states, be it Ireland, the UK, or any others, and then of course looking across the water to their markets in other jurisdictions as well, like here in the States.
How are your clients managing to do the aligning and to navigate that landscape?
Yeah, it's really challenging, I think, for clients that are operating globally, particularly because we are seeing kind of hand in hand with this proliferation of new pieces of legislation that are coming out of a national and a regional level. There's new regulators that are going to enforce and oversee those new sets of obligations as well. So in practical terms, that means that companies are looking at their existing privacy and compliance functions. They're trying to work out where they will house their additional compliance requirements that they're going to have to kind of think about who's going to be responsible for them. I mean, I think a really good example of this is AI. And we have the nearly final text of the European Artificial Intelligence Act, which was leaked on Monday of this week. And of course, that's going to really transform the landscape around children's privacy. There are very particular prohibited types of AI systems that are intended to safeguard children as a category of vulnerable people. So there's a real emphasis in that legislation on vulnerabilities of different groups by virtue of age, disability, social or economic circumstances. And so the regulators across Europe, there will have to be member state level regulators. There's going to be European central structures as well to oversee compliance with all of those new rules within the AI Act. And kind of connected, I suppose, to my comments about kind of existing compliance functions in-house in companies. We're seeing privacy lawyers getting maybe landed with responsibility for complying with the AI regime as it will come into force as well. So it's hugely challenging. And I think there are a couple of different ways in which companies tend to kind of go about this plethora of laws and requirements and kind of pieces of regulatory guidance right around Europe and then further afield as well. So sometimes we'll support companies to kind of carry out a very expansive survey of all of their obligations, and more, you can't just silo that type of
kind of review to look only at privacy obligations. You have to look at connected obligations around online safety, content moderation, and connected to that kind of consumer-related issues as well, advertising, because all of these have a bearing in the way that you interact with children as users of a digital service or within your user population. So sometimes companies will want to do a huge review of all of the different obligations that apply to them, say, across Europe, but then they'll end up with a very extensive picture and an awful lot of data, sometimes thousands and thousands of data points on all of the different rules and regulations. So then the question is, well, what are you going to do with all of that information? Do you actually have the engineering teams, the UX designers, the coders that have the ability and the understanding to take all of that information about the laws and the requirements and to be able to convert that into real life kind of architectural and design modifications? In most cases, even the biggest companies don't have that level of internal skills. So sometimes that type of exercise can be a bit impractical. So an alternative way that we see sometimes companies approaching this is to maybe look to certain jurisdictions where maybe they might be considered higher risk because of the size of their market there, or because regulators are known to be particularly active in a specific area. Very frequently, they will look to apply kind of best practice according to the rules and regulations in that area. So the Children's Code that Michael has just talked us through in the UK is generally considered, as we all know, a gold standard for children's privacy. So we do see a lot of companies taking that as the benchmark and trying to apply that globally, and then looking to identify other high-risk territories where they may need to do a bit of an add-on kind of layering to address any additional requirements that might be particularly risky for them in those jurisdictions as well. So kind of a general blanket approach with kind of modifications according to different country requirements on top of that.
You're going to be busy. Please do, Dave.
I don't want to blast everyone's ears with this thing, but you know, like talking about what U.S. companies or companies need to do in general, when you're looking at all these different regulations, you do a crosswalk, right? You kind of lay out what are the top things that you need to do, and then you kind of go through them and you say, well, what's feasible with what our teams are able to do? Are we doing them right now? What do we, look for gaps and stuff? And it's doable. And it's something you should be doing, because if you go to your engineering teams and go, we have a new law in Connecticut, we have a new law in California, your engineering teams are gonna get burned out, your business people are gonna get burned out. So I think there's a lot of value for US companies to look to Europe. The ICO has great resources on their website. The Irish DPC, another great place to look to see what are the opinions, what are European regulators doing, how are they treating children's data, and to try to future-proof your program as you're trying to say, well, what are we going to do next year, 2 years, 3 years down the line? Because sometimes internally, your engineering teams, they have 1 year, 2 year, 3 year timelines, and you're trying to meet these new regulations, and sometimes a regulation is issued, and then, we didn't realize that a particular aspect will be read this way. Or we wouldn't realize that a company would get in trouble in this way. And it's important for you because, the regulators, they may not be giving out gold stars or silver stars, but they are giving out fines. So in 2018, we had between the GDPR and COPPA, for children's issues, there's $6 million in fines. In 2019, we have $160 million in fines. 2020, $8 million. 2021, $6 million. 2022, $522 million. 2023, $435 million for getting this stuff, for not getting it right, or for running into problems. So in total, between COPPA and GDPR, we're talking about $1.5 million in fines. So you gotta get your business people and say, hey, we need resources. There's a lot of different regulations going into effect. We need to think about this, and we need to be proactive because these fines are big. And the cost of compliance up front is a lot less than getting hit with a $100, $200, $500 million fine, and then having a 10, 20-year relationship with a regulator that will be looking at you every year and making sure, are you compliant or are you not compliant? So that's my, takeaway on that.
I absolutely think, I always used to say, I've always said, we don't see privacy and safety as a cost centre, but an investment. And it's really important to do the work that you're talking about. I'm conscious of the time, and I've so many questions for you, both of you still, but I'm going to turn to you, Dave, because we've got the COPPA notice of proposed rulemaking, and when you first look at that, you don't see anything hugely groundbreaking at the outset, but once you start to dig in, there are some quite significant updates in there, and perhaps you could talk to that for us.
So I'll run through this real fast. Like the clarifications first, everyone should be thinking about this. So one of them is data retention, right? Who loves data retention? You go to the business and you say, we want to work on data retention. We want to make sure that we're deleting when we're supposed to be deleting. We want to make sure that that's what we're representing externally on deletion when it comes to children's data or other kinds of data is what we're actually doing internally. How hard is that? Can anyone sitting in this room that works in a privacy shop say, look, I know how all my engineers are using the data in my organization. I'm certain that we say we're deleting after 30 days IP address or something else, we're actually doing that. That is very hard to do. So for COPPA and one of the clarifications they're making, they're saying, look, we want to make sure that it's clear that you have to be clear about your retention policies and how you're using data. Another piece is secondary purposes, right? So you're going to sit here and you're going to say, if you're in a big company and you're like, do I know all the different ways my engineering team, my product teams are using data, right? Children's data, other data, and to make sure that the purpose is, I collected data for fraud detection, and now I have a team that I may not know about, and they're going to use it to do targeted advertising. So are you sure when you roll out a new product, do you have the process in place in the children's privacy context or just generally? Do you have a product launch calendar so that you're aware when a new product is launched or even when it's initiated that you go through and you say, okay, what does the ICO expect? What does the Irish DPC expect? What is the California regulators expecting for when a particular new product is being launched? Now, why retention is important, and this is just one of the clarifications here, is all of you in your companies, in your organizations, you have this thing, AI, that everybody's talking about, right? These things are data hungry. So you're going to have a fundamental tension between your need to delete data per your retention policy, and you're going to have the business side saying, hey, wait, you're deleting the data that I want to use to train my model. And the more data I have, the better the model is going to operate. So there's going to be this tension internally. So you have to really think about what are our retention policies? What does that look like? Do I really understand all the different ways that children's data and data in general is being used within my organization? Is that reflected in the policies? So that's a big piece of it. There's a few other things to run through, like the biometrics. They're going to start adding. They might add that to a definition. Voice commands, there's some guidance there that was codified and that's going to be codified that came out in 2017. For the big kind of changes, there's the bifurcated consent. And so right now we have verified parental consent, but they're also talking about additional consent for ad tech or third-party uses. And so when you look at your internal tech stack, and it's hard enough to understand when you're going through and you're talking to the engineers, and I'm sure all of you have had this experience. You have one conversation with the engineer, you think you understand how things work. You have a second conversation, and you learned something new about this other thing and this other aspect of a system that you're not aware of. Then you have a third conversation, and wow, there's a whole new use of data that we just, as the legal team, we weren't aware of, right? So you're going to have to sit down and have these conversations with your engineering team to understand if this goes into effect, or if some of these changes are going into effect, how you're going to handle this additional consent. So there's a few other items here, but I don't want to kind of steal the whole panel's time. But there's a lot to look at. But again, this is just draft. So
yeah, and I think the security update is pretty significant. We've had someone talking about that after us, so that we can dig into that then. But that is pretty significant. I think. With the comment period, we've waited since 2019. I think the FTC's workshop was on the rule review. We've waited an awful long time, and there is a comment period now. When do you think we might see an effective rule?
For this year, that's a tough. So the last comment period generated 175,000 comments. There's a lot of material to cover here. On its face, it may not, but when you dig into the details and you say, well, how is it going to impact my company internally? There's a lot here. And I know a lot of companies are working on comments and stuff. So I think I think, it's hard to say, and especially with the political environment in the United States where, we're right in the middle of primaries, presidential election is coming up, Congress is struggling. So we have, there's a lot of things going on that might prevent something like this, generally COPPA 2.0 or, what the FTC is doing. That administration may change, and the FTC, the composition of the board members may change. So it's a lot of change right now to think about. But again, there are things we could do today to comply with COPPA as it stands, to comply with, if you have a European footprint, with what European regulators expect. And that's kind of what you have to think about when you're meeting with your teams and going home and saying, well, what do we, going back to your office and saying, like, what do we need to do now with a view to the future by looking to Europe?
COPPA 2.0 is having a very bumpy ride, and COSA too. So, but these are the areas where there are protections for teens proposed, and that 13 to 17 age group that hasn't really been afforded the protections previously under COPPA. Interesting. Dave, you've been through an enforcement action. You've managed and handled it. What does it really mean for a company?
Yeah, like I said before, there's a splashy thing. So I was former Yahoo, former Instacart, Verizon, right? And so we got that $5 million fine, and you say, okay, wow, that's a big number. And relative to today, it isn't, but at the time it was. And so the first thing, we were fortunate enough, or I was fortunate enough, I actually met up with PRIVO. And I said, hey, what kind of things do we need to do? What do we need to think about? How can we future-proof this or make sure that we don't have these problems going forward? And so a lot of it is you're going to have to go through your whole organization and touch every part of your company and understand how they're using data and understand, for example, how they're honoring the COPPA flag. And so that is a big lift. Additionally, depending on the settlement or whatever you negotiate with regulator, there may be other obligations like third-party review, external neutral person, and that's very helpful. For example, when Claire and I would talk, we're like, what are other people doing, or how should we be thinking about this, or how can we future-proof this? It's a huge value to have somebody that's neutral, or be the person in the room to say to your business folks, look, you want to do this, that's not going to work. You're probably not going to pass your audit. So there's a lot of value. It's hard to grade your own homework, is what it amounts to. And so you need a third party to come in and say, okay, this is what you guys are doing, and this is what you should be doing. And it's hard sometimes internally because of politics or just the dynamic of your company and stuff. And I was very fortunate. Our company was definitely working. We had the resources. We had the people. We were smart enough to bring in somebody like PRIVO. And we worked very hard to get it right in that year. It was a pressure cooker of a year before our audit, our internal audit, to kind of make sure that everything was buttoned down. Because when you really dig down into your companies, and people who are in-house know this, and you really try to figure out where and how everything is working, and is it working as it should, you lift up a lot of rocks and you see things that maybe could be better, right? So that's kind of over the course of a year, but it's good to have a good partnership. It's important to have a good team, and it's important to, when you work with people, I think Claire and I, we were up I still wake up, I still get up and meet with Claire 4 o'clock in the morning on Zoom. And I still get up at 4 o'clock today. So that's, if there's any indication for what kind of an impact that had on me personally. But and you're gonna. It's sometimes like I said, working with the engineers is tough to understand what is actually going on in the company. And you may be the first person that's trying to really dig into some of this stuff and understand, are we compliant? Another big piece that no one ever talks about, I'd love to see regulators talk more, is privacy controls, or just controls in general. So everybody talks about, oh, you should do this and that, but what does that actually mean? You need to have controls and a set of controls in place to say, if I'm telling externally, I'm deleting data after 30 days, where are the checks internally that I check once a month, once every 6 months, once a year, to make sure that that's actually happening? And so you need to work with your governance, risk, and compliance team. They need to become your best friends. And you're going to send somebody that's friendly and say, hey, pretty please with sugar on top. I know you do SOX compliance. Or you're going to talk to your cybersecurity team. Can you please take my little set of privacy controls and test them too? And so that is crucial. Noria is a Dutch group. They have privacy controls for GDPR. They're excellent. And then additionally, we have NIST here that has excellent privacy controls that can give you a basis, and you can use them for COPPA compliance. You can use them for what the European regulators expect there. But if you're not checking stuff, and if you're not making sure that you're doing it, if you're the type of lawyer that says, hey, I generate a memo and I'm done, that's wrong. That's like throwing your child into the deep end of the pool with a manual of how to swim. You need to go and you need to say, okay, I'm going to work with I'm going to work internally with and measure that you're compliant and show compliance over a period of time, because that's what these guys expect, or that's what they're going to expect after hearing us talk. So anyway.
So we have to wrap up, unfortunately, but I really don't want to end, and I'm going to jump about a bit here without just really briefly touching on the gaming industry. And Anna, I know you've got experience here. How mature is it at the moment in terms of privacy and safety? And you need to do it quick.
In a nutshell, I would say the gaming industry is not at the most sophisticated end of the spectrum in terms of its approach towards online safety and privacy. It's certainly at the epicenter of kind of converging technologies and all of the regulation that goes around them. Huge risks, obviously, and opportunities for kids. And I think the spotlight is, all the indicators are there that the spotlight's going to shift maybe from social media to start to shine on gaming. The ICO has a focus on gaming. We have lots of academics, commentators coming out, and they can be very influential in terms of regulatory patterns as well. So I think gaming is the next big topic in terms of children's privacy, absolutely.